Hello everyone. Today we're going to start our 6th unit talking about rational exponents and radical functions. So more on exponents and now some roots. Today our focus is going to be to see how rational exponents are related to radicals. You're going to need your notes, something to write with, and a calculator, okay? Take good notes on the things that I prompt you to. You don't need to write everything down. Here's one thing you do need to get in your notes. We're going to be talking about a new notation. And as you read in that title, there's lots of R words to know. Radicals versus rational exponents. What's the connection and what do those words mean? So you see the number 12 there on that screen. If I put this little symbol around it, that little symbol has a name. That little symbol is called the radical sign. A lot of times we're used to that being a square root, but that's not the only type of root in the world, so we need to be careful. The 12 underneath the radical sign then becomes the radicand. Okay, he's the whatever's underneath that radical sign, whatever it is, the number, or there could be variables under there, but that represents the radicand part of that expression. And that little x out there, that has a special name. He's called the index. Most of the time for our work, we're going to have just numbers right there, like a 4 or a 3 or a 6. But that is going to be the index. He tells us what type of root we're talking about. Now, that's all the important pieces with radicals here. But what about that word rational exponent over there? What does that mean? The expression or the statement might look like this: 9 to the 1/2 power. That is not 9 1/2, okay? Not a mixed number. The 1/2 power is raised up there. He represents an exponent. So this is 9 to the 1/2 power. We're used to taking things and squaring them, cubing them. Now we're going to deal with rational exponents. Rational exponents look like that 1/2. They're written in fraction form. Okay, so our exponents are going to be fractions up there. There's a connection that we need to see today between radicals, what you see on the left, and rational exponents, which you see on the right. So I'm going to do some typing here in my calculator to figure out some values here. I want you to be thinking about, not writing down, what is a simple way to explain this whole idea of a 1/2 power. So if I type in 25 and I raise him up to the 1/2 power, like this in my calculator, 25 to the 1/2, then I get a value of 5. 36 to the 1/2 gives me a value of 6. 49 to the 1/2 gives me a value of 7. 64 to the 1/2 gives me a value of 8. As you look at these numbers and these numbers, you should be seeing a little something that looks familiar. In fact, the 1/2 power is the same as a square root. So what if the power was a 1/3? Well, that would be a cube root. So the value for this expression here is 2, and this one is a 4, because a 1/3 power is the same thing as a cube root. So now we're going to summarize that in your notes in this little chart. How are rational exponents related to radicals? So get this chart copied in your notes, maybe pause right now, and we're going to fill in some things. Okay, rational exponents, let's take a look. X to the 1/2 power means that we're talking about a square root. And so in radical form, what I would write is the square root sign and an x on the inside. Okay, what if I have x to the 1/3 power? What does that mean? That represents a cube root. So how do I write that in radical form? There's the radical sign. X is still on the inside, but this is a different type of root. His index needs to be a 3. You'll notice on the square root, we didn't write the little 2 right there, but technically he's there. It's implied. Square roots cancel out a squared, so there would be a little 2 right there. Okay, we usually don't write it there, but we should know that that's really what's happening. And then x to the 1/4 is a 4th root. So when I write him in radical form, it'd have a 4 for an index on my radical sign, and then the x would be inside. Most of the time those x's will be numbers for us. So this idea of writing exponents as roots and vice versa is really going to help us out as we go forward. So what about if I have 8 raised to the 2/3 power? This is not a mixed number, 8 and 2/3. 8 and 2/3 looks like this. The 2/3 is not raised up in the exponent spot, okay? 8 to the 2/3 power is an exponent we have up there as a 2/3, okay? So be careful. Well, what does that represent? Here's another thing you need to get in your notes. Those also represent roots. They're just written differently. So let's talk about how do we change forms to make them make more sense. Copy this part in your notes. Make sure you write the whole thing down. Radical to rational exponent and vice versa. Radical form is going to have a root sign. That's what we were just talking about. Rational exponent form has an exponent that can be written as a fraction up there. And we can change back and forth between the two. Let's say my problem starts like this. I have something raised to a fraction power, and if I rewrite him in radical form, like this, notice the key places that the m and n go when we're talking about radicals versus rational exponents. Notice that the n, the number on the bottom, is the type of root we're talking about. Okay, and the m, if there is a special m, usually it's a 1 in the cases we were talking about, but the m could be a 2, the n could be a 4, whatever it might be, that is telling me what kind of power I am raising my root to. Okay, so there's a special way that we can rewrite these in root form or in rational exponent form, and we're going to practice that right now. So let's take a moment and write these 6 examples in there, and then we're going to go through and change their forms. So if I was going to rewrite the expression using radical notation and I had 7 raised to the 1/2 power, we just talked about that. That is the same thing as a square root of 7. Now if I have 4 to the 4/3 power, that means I have a radical sign with a 4 on the inside. But this is not a square root. The type of root it is a cube root. And that cube root is raised to the 4th power. And number 3, I have a 2, the base is 2, inside of a radical sign. What type of root am I talking about? I am talking about a cube root that is being raised to the 5th power, if we follow what we wrote in our notes just prior to this slide. And then number 4, 7 is a cube root. Inside is a 7, and it's raised to the 4th power. And then the next one, if I just kept going, 6 is inside of a square root. Remember that square root. Most of the time we don't write the 2 on that radical sign, but that's fine if you want to. And then it's raised to the 3rd power. And then last but not least, 2 is inside of a radical sign. The type of root is a 6, and it's raised to the 1st power. You don't have to write it, because anything to the 1st power would maintain the same value, so you don't need that little 1 power if you don't want to. Okay, so we took all of our rational exponents and turned them into radicals. Now can we do the reverse? Here's 6 more. Can we take them out of rational, or can we take them out of radical form and write them in rational exponent form? So we'll go quickly through these. Go ahead and write them in your notes. You need a few examples. Let's talk about this. Well, it looks like the base is a 10. And then what kind of exponent would we have up here? We know it's going to be a fraction. What type of root do we have? That's a square root. Okay, the little 2's not written there, but we know that that's what that means. And he's raised to the 3rd power, so this would be the same thing as 10 to the 3/2 power. Let's talk about the next one. 2 is the base. It's a 6th root. And what kind of power or exponent is this raised up to? Well, just a 1, right? That's all we would see there. There he is. And then the third one. 2 is the base. It's a 4th root raised to the 5th power. And the next one, again, 2 is the base. It's a 3rd root raised to the 1st power. And then 5, 10 is the base. It's a 6th root raised to the 1st power. And then number 6, last but not least, 10. And it's a cube root raised to the 7th power. So changing forms is going to help us out quite a bit. Now, how do I find these values in the calculator? If I want to figure out and I want to get to know my calculator a little bit, this is the last part we need to be able to do. How do you figure that out? It depends on what your calculator looks like, okay? When we're going to take these root signs, guys, we're talking about cube roots now. You are not going to use the square root button. Near your square root button, there's probably going to be a button that has a little X or something up there where that index is. On my phone calculator, here it is right there. That's the type that takes other roots besides square roots. that's the button you're going to need to use. On this Texas Instrument one you see, you have to hit the type root first, then that button, and you can type the -8 on the inside. And yes, there's a negative inside of a root, but this is a cube root, not a square root. So this does give me an answer of -2. Okay, please make sure that you know how to use your calculator. We'll practice some more. Everybody's calculators are different, so you need to be searching for those buttons. And then the fourth root of 625. Think about where that would be on your calculator. How would you figure that out? You'd be using that button you see right here, or this button right here. You may hit the fourth and then that thing, or some of you have to hit this first and then put the 625 and then put the 4 in there. It depends on the type of your calculator or the type of calculator you have. So please get to know your calculator, but when you type that in, you should get a 5 for that value. We also need to know how to type in these powers. So 256 raised up to the 1/4 power. You want to use the button that gets you any sort of exponent, not a squared, but things that are other exponents. This is the button that I have on my calculator. It's the caret button. And then since 1/4 is a fraction on my calculator, I have to use parentheses. Many of you have fraction buttons. But when you type that in, 256 to the 1/4 power, make sure that you get a 4. And then 32 raised up to the 1/5 power, make sure you get a 2. So we need to get to know our calculator and then remember what these things represent. Okay? Thank you very much for taking good notes.